Well, basically, we've been friends since we were 12 years old, and
Last Christmas I gave you my heart, but the very next
It took a few adaptations along the way, to get to cope with different situations.
wake me up before you go, 'cause I'm not planning on going solo.
It didn't happen during a fight. There was no final argument, no slam door. Just a moment where Andrew Ridgeley realized that whatever Wham had been, it wasn't going to be that anymore. He didn't say anything right away. Neither of them did. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. The silence between them lasted longer than anyone ever talks about. Longer than the headlines. Longer than the farewell performances that made it look clean and celebratory. From the outside, Wham ended at the top. Two young men, bright clothes, packed arenas, the kind of ending bands are told to dream about. But that version never sat right with Andrew, because what people saw as confidence, he remembered as hesitation. What people saw as ambition, he remembered as distance. And what people assumed was mutual agreement was something far quieter. Andrew Ridgeley had always understood his role, not as a backup, not as a shadow, but as balance. From the earliest days when they were still boys testing melodies in bedrooms and borrowed studios, Andrew wasn't trying to be the loudest voice in the room. He was trying to protect the room itself. George Michael burned hot. Ideas came fast. Emotions came faster. Andrew absorbed the overflow. He smoothed edges. He deflected pressure. He made the chaos survivable. That dynamic became invisible once the records hit, once the crowd screamed, once the story simplified itself into a familiar shape. Frontman, partner. But Andrew never thought of it that way, and neither did George, at least, not at first. As Wham grew, the world began asking a question Andrew didn't know how to answer. What exactly do you do? It was never asked out loud at first. It showed up in interviews that drifted toward George, in praise that landed unevenly, in expectations that quietly shifted. Andrew noticed how George listened to those questions. He didn't react. He didn't correct them, but something tightened. George had always been sensitive to how he was seen, not in a vain way, in a vigilant way. He felt misunderstood easily, and once that feeling took hold, it didn't loosen. The music began changing before anyone acknowledged it. Longer writing sessions, more time alone, lyrics that turned inward. Andrew supported it. He encouraged it. But encouragement doesn't stop separation. What most people don't realize is that Andrew wasn't surprised when the idea of ending Wham surfaced. He was surprised by how quietly it arrived. There was no dramatic announcement between them, no declaration. Just conversations that circled the same truth without touching it. George wanted space, not distance, space. Space to write without compromise. Space to sing without expectation. Space to exist without the weight of a shared identity. Andrew understood that intellectually. Emotionally, it landed differently. Because for Andrew, Wham wasn't a stepping stone. It was the thing, not fame, not charts, the partnership. What he felt wasn't betrayal, it was displacement, and that's harder to argue against. As the conversations continued, Andrew noticed something else. George never framed it as leaving, he framed it as becoming. That distinction mattered. To George, Wham wasn't ending because it failed. It was ending because it had done its job. Andrew didn't disagree. He just felt the cost more immediately. There were moments, small ones, that stayed with him. A studio session where George recorded vocals alone. A meeting where decisions were made faster than Andrew could process. A sense that the future had already been rehearsed. Without him. None of it was cruel. That was the hardest part. Cruelty would have been easier. When the official announcement came, it was delivered with confidence and smiles. They spoke about timing, about growth, about leaving before things went wrong. The world accepted that explanation gladly. But Andrew knew it wasn't the full story, because something else had been happening underneath the optimism. George had been carrying something he didn't say out loud, not to the press, not even to Andrew, at least not clearly. Andrew sensed it in the pauses, in the way George chose his words carefully, in the way he avoided certain topics altogether. There was a fear there, not of failure, of being seen. George was on the verge of a life that demanded full exposure, full authorship, full responsibility. Wham had been a shield as much as a launch pad, and Andrew had been part of that shield. Letting go of the band meant letting go of protection for both of them, but in very different ways. Andrew watched George step closer to that edge with determination that bordered on tension. He admired it, he worried about it, and he never asked the question that sat between them, not because he didn't want to know, but because once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. When Wham finally took the stage for the last time, the atmosphere was celebratory. The crowd believed they were witnessing a perfect ending. Andrew smiled. He performed. He did everything right. But internally, something remained unsettled. Not sadness, not anger, uncertainty. Because he still didn't know if Wham ended because it was time, or because one of them couldn't stay any longer, and more importantly, whether George was running toward something or away from something he couldn't yet name. That question followed Andrew long after the lights went down, and it wouldn't be answered for years. After the final performance, life didn't collapse the way people expected it to. There was no dramatic aftermath, no sudden emptiness. For Andrew Ridgeley, the strange part was how normal everything looked from the outside. George disappeared into work almost immediately. New collaborators, new studios, new intensity. Andrew stepped back, not out of bitterness, out of instinct. He told himself this was what adulthood looked like. Two people choosing different rhythms without resentment. And for a while, that explanation held. But silence has weight, and silence accumulates. Andrew noticed how rarely George spoke about Wham once it was over, not dismissively, just briefly. When asked, George described it as a chapter that had closed cleanly. Necessary. Right. Andrew didn't contradict him. He didn't add the parts that didn't fit, because there were moments, Andrew remembered, that didn't sound clean at all. He remembered late conversations where George circled the idea of identity without naming it, where success felt less like triumph and more like exposure. Fame had magnified everything George tried to keep private, and Wham, unintentionally, had amplified it further. Andrew began to understand something that hadn't been clear while they were still together. Wham wasn't just a band to George, it was a mirror. Every interview, every performance, every lyric that landed differently than intended. The brighter the image became, the harder it was for George to control what people thought they saw. Andrew had been there to soften that reflection, to redirect attention, to share the frame. Without him, George stood alone in it, and that terrified him, even as he wanted it. Years passed. George's solo career exploded. Critical acclaim replaced pop exuberance. Depth replaced playfulness. From a distance, it looked like vindication, but Andrew noticed the cracks early, not publicly, privately. George withdrew more than he connected, trusted fewer people, spoke cautiously, even to old friends. Andrew understood now that Wham hadn't just ended because George wanted artistic freedom. It ended because George was trying to survive himself. There were things George couldn't say while Wham existed, not because Andrew would judge him, but because saying them would fracture the image they were standing inside. Together, Andrew never pressured him to explain. He waited, and waiting became a habit. When Andrew did speak publicly years later, he chose his words carefully. He emphasized friendship, mutual respect, timing. All of it was true, but still incomplete, because there was an emotional asymmetry that never fully resolved. Andrew had mourned Wham quietly, privately, without an audience. George had transformed it into something else, something productive, something powerful. That difference mattered, not as a grievance, as a truth. Andrew didn't resent George's success. He resented the narrative that Wham ended cleanly, painlessly, as a shared decision without consequence. Because consequences don't always look like conflict. Sometimes they look like distance that never closes. As George's public persona grew more controlled, Andrew noticed how guarded his private one became, how rarely George spoke plainly about fear or loneliness. Those were the things he never said out loud, and Andrew suspected why. Because once Wham ended, George no longer had a place to hide uncertainty. Every doubt belonged solely to him. Andrew believed, and quietly, that part of George wished the ending had been messier. Messiness would have allowed blame. Clean endings leave nowhere to put regret. They remained connected, but not close. Fond, but careful. Two people who shared something enormous and never fully revisited it. Then, years later, Andrew heard something George said in passing during an interview. A small comment, almost throwaway. But Andrew recognized the weight beneath it immediately. It wasn't about Wham, not directly. It was about pressure, about being seen before being ready, about losing the ability to choose silence. And in that moment, Andrew realized something he hadn't allowed himself to articulate before. Wham didn't end because George outgrew it. It ended because George was afraid of staying, afraid that the longer he remained inside that image, the less control he would have over who he truly was. But Andrew still didn't know the deepest part, the part George never told him, the part George barely admitted to himself. That truth would surface only much later, after loss, after reflection, after it no longer mattered professionally. And when it finally did, Andrew understood why George had never said it out loud, because saying it would have meant admitting that Wham hadn't just been a band. It had been safety. Andrew didn't hear the full truth all at once. It arrived in fragments. A line in an interview years after it mattered. A lyric that sounded less like confession and more like relief. A comment from someone who had been there, close enough to notice what George never articulated. By then, George no longer needed to protect an image, and Andrew no longer needed answers for himself. What George had never said out loud, not clearly, not directly, was that Wham had given him permission to exist. Before he understood himself, inside the band, he could share authorship, share responsibility, share attention. It diluted the fear. But as the spotlight grew harsher, that dilution stopped working. George wasn't just writing songs. He was negotiating identity in real time, under global observation. Wham had been bright, joyful, accessible. And George was becoming something quieter, more complex, less certain. Staying meant performing a version of himself that felt increasingly unsafe. Leaving meant facing everything alone. The choice wasn't about ambition, it was about control and fear. George feared being defined before he was ready to define himself, feared that staying inside Wham would freeze him in an image he couldn't survive long term. Andrew realized this only later, when George finally spoke, not about Wham, but about the pressure of visibility, about the cost of being seen before being understood. Wham had ended, not because it limited George's creativity, but because it delayed his honesty, and that honesty terrified him. Andrew never took that personally. He couldn't, because he knew the truth beneath it. George hadn't left Wham to escape Andrew. He had left to confront himself. The irony was that Andrew had been the one person who would have stayed without demanding explanation, who would have protected the silence. But George needed solitude to speak truths he didn't yet have language for. By the time those truths surfaced, it was too late to share them safely. Loss changes how memory speaks. After George was gone, Andrew became more careful with his words, not because the story was fragile, but because it was human. He resisted framing Wham's end as inevitability or destiny. Instead, he spoke of timing, of sensitivity, of two people moving through the same moment with different needs. That was as close as he ever came. Andrew understood now that Wham had been both a beginning and a refuge. For George, it had been a place to hide while becoming. For Andrew, it had been a place to belong. Neither of those truths cancel the other. They simply coexist. In the years that followed, Andrew never attempted to replace Wham. Not musically, not emotionally. He didn't chase reinvention. He allowed the story to remain what it was, incomplete. Because some endings aren't meant to feel finished. When people ask Andrew now why Wham ended, he doesn't correct them when they say it ended perfectly. He lets them believe that, because the real ending wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. Two young men recognizing that the same shelter no longer protected them equally. George never said that out loud, but Andrew heard it anyway. In the pauses, in the careful phrasing, in the way George carried both relief and grief at the same time. Wham didn't break, it was released. And in that release, both of them lost something they never tried to replace. Not success, safety. And maybe that's why the story still lingers, because behind the bright colors and perfect melodies, there was a moment neither of them could fully explain, only live with, and Andrew did, quietly.